Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Since China's reform and opening up to the world, and before US-China tension became the news headline every day, American interest in China was more limited to scholars, artists, a few China hands in Washington, D.C., and those who pioneered business relationships with China. Today, our guest is Professor Andrew Nathan of Columbia University, who's been one of the most revered China scholars in the world and a familiar face to Taiwan. He not only contributes academically through his teaching and research, he's been one of the strongest advocates for human rights and democracy. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Andy, many of your students have become top policymakers or leading practitioners in the realm of China and Pan-Asian affairs, including quite a few from Taiwan. Now, as a longtime observer of China, has anything about Xi Jinping's leadership surprised you?
Well, it has. I think it's surprised all of us because we thought China was on a track of liberalization. And we thought that the economic model they were developing was one that gave more space to private enterprise, and that economic model required political freedoms. But Xi Jinping has changed course and has forged a new model, which may or may not work, in which there's greater state control of the economy and more political crackdown. So I didn't expect that, and I don't think most of us expected it.
So this sounds like political and economic liberalization. In the West, at least, we assume it needs to go hand in hand. But in the context of China, it doesn't have to be in that case. Would you say that's sort of the thesis?
That seems to be it. And some Chinese theorists are developing a concept of sort of an alternative modernity, that China can modernize and, be strong without political liberalization, and that its regime can be legitimate or legitimated, if you will, without political accountability. So they're testing this new model, which Xi Jinping has even called a Chinese proposition, a 中国方案, for other countries to potentially emulate. So, but whether it's going to work or not, we're all watching with bated breath, because on the economic side, they seem to be encountering an economic slowdown. And on the political side, there's the feeling, it's hard to scientifically substantiate this, but there's the feeling that the legitimacy of the regime is kind of shallow. They have a lot of support among the population, but a lot of it is based on economic growth and nationalism. And if the regime should stumble in some way, we have a sort of a feeling, if you will, that that support for the regime could diminish, could collapse very quickly. So we don't know if this new model is really going to work. But I have to add that at the same time, Western regimes are to some extent emulating the Chinese model. So the United States and the European countries have adopted what we used to say we shouldn't have: industrial policy, government intervention into the economy. So, history is very interesting because it constantly poses new puzzles.
Right. I think the very last time, I would say, the how the world was surprised by China's development when it comes to liberalization direction was probably June 4th, right? That took the world by surprise. And of course, June 4th is just around the corner. And you're known for co-editing the Tiananmen Papers and then being barred from entering China since. And watching what happened in Hong Kong, where the largest June 4th visuals used to be held but are now banned. How do you feel about those developments?
Well, when you say, how do I feel, it's a question of my emotional response rather than intellectual response. I mean, I just feel terrible. It's so, what's happening in Hong Kong is so shocking, so painful to see, especially with those human rights and democracy advocates in prison, oftentimes without bail, even not sentenced or sentenced to long terms. Young Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, young people, brave people who are in jail for long years, I must say, feel very helpless about it. U.S. is a big, powerful country. Britain has a treaty right to protest what's going on in Hong Kong, but China's strong and doesn't take orders from anybody. So it's just a very sad and hopeless feeling about Hong Kong.
And setting aside the personal feelings, intellectually speaking, how do you analyze the situation?
Okay, I have a sort of a lengthy analysis of the situation in Hong Kong, but let me try to boil it down, which is that and underlying everything I've said so far is my sense that Xi Jinping assesses the United States as an existential threat to his regime. So we could talk a lot about that.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks that Western culture and American military power and the Taiwan issue and so forth are all parts of a big, serious plan for the United States to try to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. And in that context, Hong Kong, he felt, had to be controlled. And he thought for a long time, and before him as well, Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao all thought, we can rely upon the pro-Beijing elite in Hong Kong to control what's happening in Hong Kong politically. But it didn't work. So finally, Beijing, Xi Jinping was very decisive, which is one of his characteristics. And he said, okay, we're going to put a stop to this evolution of so-called Hong Kong identity, Xiangangren identity, and we're going to just stop it. And he put in this national security law, which completely crushes all independent political activity in Hong Kong in a very effective manner, at great expense to the culture and the rule of law and the credibility of Hong Kong for the outside world. That's my analysis.
Yeah, so when you say Xi Jinping views the West, of course, US-led West, as an existential threat to China or CCP, do you think that view has always been this strong, or it's evolved to be even more so in some way because of the US behavior? What do you think is going on?
So I think it has evolved with reality, as it were. So Deng Xiaoping had this strategy, as you know, of hide one's light and bide one's time, and we can work with the West in order to strengthen ourselves. But I don't think Deng Xiaoping ever thought that, okay, we're going to sort of merge with the West into one happy global family. I think he always thought, as any government leader would think, we need to guarantee our own security, not rely upon the United States to provide the security of China's sea lanes and so forth. So we need to build up our strength. As China built up its strength, it expected the United States to react against that, to try to preserve its dominant power in the world and in Asia. And so the United States has responded in that way, has said, oh my God, there's somebody challenging us. There's a peer competitor. We gotta compete. And that competition is economic and it's military. It's not so much, I must say, cultural or ideological. That is to say that the West isn't really telling, Xi Jinping says, Jianghao Zhongguo de Gushi, and the United States is not really Jianghao Meiguo de Gushi.
Yeah.
We're a little bit flat-footed about that part of the competition.
Yeah. I would say, sort of the awakening in the US, and when it comes to the view of China, it was also pretty sudden and abrupt. And I like to call your generation of China experts the real deal, right? Scholarly, intellectual, fluent in Chinese, versed in Chinese history and culture. But of course, today everyone is speaking on China as if they're China experts. And so, some opinions are better informed than the others. And how do you feel about all these conversations about China?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the fact that everybody talks about China is a sign that China has become a global power, and it's involved in every issue that exists, whether it's climate, the Arctic, the Middle East, Saudi-Iranian relations, and so forth. Everything is China is part of every issue.
Yeah.
What I worry about, and a lot of the conversation coming from experts in these other areas, like let's say climate, is well informed on the China piece of the story. But what I do worry about is the what you might call China panic in the political sphere, where there are views among without dragging us into partisanship, but let's face it, there are views, especially among the right wing of the Republican Party, let's say Pompeo or Mike Pence and Trump, that somehow the rise of China threatens Western civilization and represents a crisis of survival for the West. And I don't think that's true. I think our issues with China are big ones. Taiwan, control of the cyber technologies and other 21st century technology, supply chains, human rights issues in the UN are big issues. But it doesn't mean that Western civilization or Christianity or something like that is, gonna be threatened by the rise of China. So I would like to put the China issue, which again is a big issue, I'm not saying that it isn't, into some kind of perspective so that we can deal realistically. And I do like the Biden administration's policy, which is one of what they call strategic competition. It's competition, but China's not going to go away. And if you think you can have a new Cold War that ends with the somehow collapse of China, that's not really a strategy. I don't.
That's interesting. You say you like the Biden administration's policy. I think they frame it slightly different. And of course, also working more with the allies. But a lot of people, observers also say they basically continue the Trump administration's policy. It's just the execution is probably, better done. Would you agree?
I think that not quite. It depends on what you think the Trump policy was, which is a confusing subject because of Trump's personality of switching back and forth and giving Xi Jinping chocolate cake one day and then putting, tariffs on Chinese imports and probably the wrong imports another day. And Trump's administration was very divided among people on the one hand who, like the Secretary of the Treasury, what was his name? I forget.
Mnuchin.
Mnuchin, who, along with many others, believe that there's a lot of money to be made in China. We should have a good relationship versus, for example, Peter Navarro, who felt that, published a documentary movie called Death by China, Extreme, or Pompeo. They were divided. It was a mess, I would say, without a strategy. I think the Biden policy has an actual strategy, one of which you mentioned is working with allies, where the Trump administration didn't do that. Another one is really having an industrial policy that tries to address supply chains and promote 21st century technologies, which the Xi Jinping regime has been promoting in a very policy-oriented way, but also keeping open the window to cooperation. So we saw the Tony Blinken visit be canceled because of the balloon thing, but the Biden administration keeps on working on let's meet, let's have mill-to-mill communication, let's have diplomatic communication, let's avoid miscommunication, especially over, not especially, but including over the Taiwan issue.
Yeah, I think, the Taiwan issue, no doubt, is one of the thorniest issues between US and China. And, contrary to many recent news headlines, you've said that China has a long game on Taiwan and is unlikely to invade Taiwan now. And why?
Unlikely unless we force Xi Jinping to do so by doing something dumb on our side that would require the Chinese to attack. But if we, take it cool,
and what would be considered dumb and what would be considered cool?
So what would be considered taking it cool would be to uphold our policy that our interest lies in peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, and that we're not promoting Taiwan independence or advancing step by step the de facto independence of Taiwan beyond where it is today by, for example, adopting strategic clarity, as some thinkers advocate that we should do, saying that we will definitely defend Taiwan no matter what, or by giving diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, for example, which some people advocate. We shouldn't do those things.
And obviously these are red lines, and the Biden administration, even the Trump administration didn't do that. But do you think we are staying cool right now, or we're in between?
Yeah, it's because Biden has said, as you know, if China attacks, we will defend. But then the White House has, quote unquote, clarified we haven't changed our policy. So I mean, it's a little unclear. But I published with some of my colleagues a paper in which we said that deterrence, which we support, has two aspects. One is a credible military threat of punishment if the other side moves, and that means if Beijing attacks. But the other important part of deterrence is a credible assurance that if the other side doesn't attack, they won't lose, that we won't then take advantage of that to cross the red lines, as you said. They won't lose by holding back. So then on your question of why would Xi Jinping hold back instead of attacking now, there are, I guess, three big reasons. One is that he assesses, and here I don't have much evidence for this, but I'm trying to think what he might be thinking as he looks at the world. And based on things that they have said, he assesses that Chinese power is increasing and American power is diminishing in a secular way, that is over a long period of time. So the future will be a better time to attack when the United States won't fight back. Secondly, he thinks, and here I think he's probably wrong, but he thinks the political balance within Taiwan is still not settled. The KMT is still, has an option. The DPP has issues. The public opinion is definitely anti-mainland China, but China still has some leverage. It has economic leverage. It has media leverage. And so he hasn't given up hope on that. And thirdly, that he knows that and the Ukraine war has only reinforced his perception that the Chinese military isn't ready yet to win that war.
Well, you've touched upon a number of issues that I really wanted to delve deeper into. The first one is, as you mentioned, the paper that you wrote in Foreign Affairs, and how you still think strategic ambiguity should be abided by on the US side. However, I do want to point out that I think the strategic ambiguity policy was really based on sort of, this, the US doesn't really want to take a stance between ROC and PRC when it comes to like who has the legitimate representation of China, right?
Mhm, mhm.
However, the changing part of this equation is that it seems that most Taiwanese people don't even want to claim the legitimate representation of China anymore. Instead, there's this development of a distinctively independent identity. And so that changing identity in and of Taiwan itself is making the old policy, strategic ambiguity, and even deterrence, assurance, and all these things seem less effective and less suitable to the current dilemma, which comes down to the ultimate question: will Taiwan and China come together in the future, as I would say the old school and most people expected over the last few decades, or it'll just go different ways?
Mm. I interpret strategic ambiguity as itself ambiguous, right? But my understanding of it is that it's chiefly about what would the United States military response be if China attacks or surrounds Taiwan and tries to cut off Taiwan's trade and so forth. What would our military response be? And I think the reason for not, so it's basically that we don't say what we would do, but we just do. Because when we say, like Biden did, we're going to defend Taiwan no matter what, the saying of it is provocative. The doing of building up our appropriate military posture both in Taiwan and around Taiwan, the Chinese know that. They see that. They see that we are prepared. That's enough. We don't need to talk about it. On your
Yeah.
question of what are the prospects, I just mentioned, I think Xi Jinping feels that he still has some leverage. I personally agree with the impulse of your statement, and it applies as well to Hong Kong, and it applies to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang and to Tibet. China has a big problem with all of these identity issues that I don't see a prospect for Beijing, especially the way that Beijing behaves, the kind of political system that they have. I do not see a prospect of their making the most of the population of Taiwan love the People's Republic and say, oh, I want to be part of that big picture. No, it's going the other direction with all of these populations because the regime is so, let's face it, unattractive. And to minority populations of various types because of Han chauvinism, because of communist, Marxist Xi Jinping's young, it's unattractive. But Beijing government doesn't seem to realize that. They haven't given up wanting to be loved by these other populations.
Or they don't really factor that right into the whole picture, or they don't think it is as important, sort of, being loved or popular. They just,
well, that's part of it. And I don't think they appreciate identity, whether it's religious identity, whether it's ethnic or civic identity, maybe because they're Marxists and they think all of those things are nothing but the superstructure, Shangcang Jiego, they'll respond to economic and political. I don't know why they don't understand that. They're not woke like us here in New York. We're woke. We understand that.
Well, you did mention, Xi Jinping still thinks the future is probably on his side when it comes to Taiwan. So the strategic patience with Taiwan probably is reflective of his view that ultimately West is in decline. And so he's just waiting for the right time to move. And how would you say, how prevalent is that view in Beijing? And, at what point would Beijing say, okay, China is ready? Like, China is truly in a favorable place that it can be much more assertive, forceful, and really to project its power more than economic power, but military power.
Hmm. I don't know how prevalent it is in Beijing because we don't have freedom of speech in Beijing. We don't have robust debate, so you don't know
Mm-hmm.
what people think. Um, and even whether the view that I presented is actually the view, I don't have robust evidence
Mm-hmm.
for that. When would they be ready? So, I mean, there are various. So one time they would be ready, as I said, is if the United States provokes them or Taiwan declares independence or something, which of course I don't expect to happen. And so they wouldn't be ready, but they would be forced to move. They would feel they were. But when would they really be ready would be, let's say that the United States, uh, enters into a recession, budget crisis, cuts the defense budget. These things are not likely, but I'm just trying to imagine a scenario. Or the United States does get directly involved in a war with Russia,
Mm.
which through the Ukraine crisis.
Mm-hmm.
or or the United States just, uh, stagnates over the course of 20 years or something like that, and our Navy, the Chinese Navy continues to get bigger than the American Navy and things of this kind.
Yeah.
And technology, military technology, China catches up. The US, for example, doesn't have enough chips to
Mm.
supply chain to really keep an advanced military, some scenario like that. And a
Yeah.
future Chinese leader might say, oh, now the military balance has shifted in a decisive manner and I can test the Americans and they won't respond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's hope that day doesn't come. Um, and you mentioned Russia as well. Do you think the Ukraine-Russia war changed sort of China's long game?
I'm guessing this is speculation as well, but when they saw, of course, what they saw was a response by Joe Biden, who was,
Mm.
may or may not be the next president after 2024. So, for example, if you have Trump or whoever that comes in who says, the whole Ukraine thing is not my problem, I want to get out of there, that would send a different signal. But
Mm.
the signal that they've seen now with the Biden administration is, I think, a very wise policy, mobilizing the allies, treading very cautiously so as not to escalate into a direct NATO-Russia war. And they've seen Western technology superior to Russian military technology. So that's what we have all seen. I'm sure they see it. And what conclusion can they draw from that is that let's not tangle with at least the Biden administration.
Yeah.
But if somebody else comes into office and they assess that individual as weak, like Trump, all talk, no action, then they might draw a different lesson. One of the lessons that we all can draw is that the American political system changes its president every
Yes.
4 or 8 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And there used to be some continuity in terms of,
Yeah, yeah,
foreign
that's right.
policy and culture, but it no longer does.
That's a
Yeah.
great point because the electorate is more polarized than it used to be, and therefore the presidents are more different from each
Right.
other than they used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, an important piece of, this relationship is obviously Taiwan. So now that Taiwan has an upcoming presidential election in January, and both parties, primary parties, have nominated their nominees, how is that going to change or not the cross-strait and U.S., Taiwan, China trilateral relationship? if there's a change of ruling party?
If there's a change, well, the KMT, I assume that Ho Yo-i is going to basically stick to what has been the core KMT policy articulated by various KMT officials, which would be to seek a lowering of tension with mainland China without pursuing unification. So for many of us, sounds kind of nonsense. I mean, if you don't pursue unification, how can you lower tension? But I personally think that does make sense. It can be done based upon my previous analysis that I told you of Xi Jinping's approach, which is if you're not moving toward independence and you're keeping the status quo, then we have a long term and we can, we don't have to have a crisis right now. Not good for Beijing either. We're all sort of curious about Lai Ching-te's stance, because in the past he's had the reputation as somebody who's very pro-independence, but if he were to become president, would he stick to the Tsai Ing-wen stance, which in Washington and in the United States has been viewed as very smart, correct? If he sticks to the Tsai Ing-wen position, Beijing will not be happy that the DPP got elected, but neither will Lai Ching-te's policy trigger a crisis. But if he were to do the sorts of things that Chen Shui-bian used to do, then we would expect things across the Taiwan Strait to get worse.
So then what is your biggest worry then, since there's so much uncertainty, whether it's in the US, Taiwan, or even in Beijing?
My biggest worry, probably, to be honest, is the US. Our politics are the least predictable and of all three sides.
Yeah, it's interesting because the US used to be the most stable and predictable side of among all these things. But it seems that there's a lot of uncertainty these days. And so, 2024, who's going to be the leader, clearly will have a huge impact, not just in the US or, with Taiwan, China, but just the world in general. So, there's a lot to worry about, but we're thankful that, we have a clear-headed analysts like you to keep reminding us, striking the balance and in terms of policy and the tone and rhetoric is important. So thank you for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.